got some really bad news.
Are you serious?
I just found out that, Nick died. He's dead.
Some of the most unforgettable moments on Deadliest Catch happened in the middle of violent storms. But for several of the men who helped make the show what it became, the hardest battles began after they left the Bering Sea. Behind the crab pots, close calls, and record catches were stories of addiction, sudden loss, and lives that took heartbreaking turns.
Phil Harris, the fishing boat captain, whose adventures off the Alaska coast were captured on the television show Deadliest Catch, has died.
Some died far too young. Others exchanged the wheelhouse for a courtroom or a prison cell.
Tonight, police say Jacob Harris was the one getting caught, and now he's in a Phoenix jail.
What really happened to the men behind Deadliest Catch? And where are they now? Join us as we uncover the cast members who are dead or have been jailed as of 2026. Phil Harris. Long before Deadliest Catch became one of television's biggest reality series, Captain Phil Harris had already become a legend on the Bering Sea. And for many fans, no captain represented Deadliest Catch quite like him. Phil started fishing as a teenager and dedicated most of his life to the industry. Years of brutal weather, sleepless nights, and the constant pressure of running a successful crab boat shaped him into the captain people came to know. He expected hard work from everyone on deck, especially his sons, Josh and Jake, who eventually joined him aboard the Cornelia Marie. By the time Deadliest Catch became a global hit, Phil had become one of its biggest stars. However, nothing suggested that the season would become the final chapter of his life. During the 2010 Apelio crab season, everything changed. While the Cornelia Marie was offloading its catch in Alaska, Phil suddenly collapsed after suffering a massive stroke. He was immediately rushed to the hospital and underwent emergency surgery. At first, there was reason to believe he might survive. He was awake, talking with family members, joking with his sons, and even asking about the boat and the business. For a moment, it seemed like the captain, who had survived decades on the Bering Sea, might pull through one more fight. But those hopes did not last. Complications from the stroke quickly worsened his condition, and on February 9, 2010, Phil Harris died at the age of 53. His death shocked not only the fishing industry, but also millions of viewers who had followed his journey since the show's early seasons. The series handled the loss with remarkable restraint, showing the raw grief of Josh and Jake as they struggled to accept that their father was gone. Fellow captains also paid tribute to a man they deeply respected. Phil Harris left behind more than a fishing legacy. He became one of the defining faces of Deadliest Catch, and for many viewers, the show was never quite the same after his death. However, he was not the only familiar face whose story ended in heartbreak. Years later, another respected fisherman fought a very different battle, one that followed him long after he stepped off the boat. Nick McGlashan. To Deadliest Catch viewers, Nick McGlashan was one of the hardest-working deckhands on the Bering Sea. However, what many people did not realize was that, behind every fishing season, he was fighting an addiction that nearly destroyed his life. Nick McGlashan grew up in commercial fishing. Born into a multi-generational Alaskan fishing family, he stepped onto a working boat while he was still a child, and quickly learned the demanding lifestyle that came with it. Whether it meant hauling heavy pots, repairing equipment, or helping inexperienced deckhands keep up with the relentless pace, he was always active. But behind the scenes, years of addiction slowly took hold of his life. Nick later revealed that he had become dependent on alcohol, heroin, and methamphetamine, a struggle that nearly cost him everything. At one point, he overdosed several times before finally realizing he needed help. Even while filming, He tried to hide how serious his addiction had become, continuing to work through long fishing seasons as his personal life unraveled. Eventually, the cracks became impossible to ignore. His performance aboard the Summer Bay declined, and Captain Wild Bill Wickrowski made the difficult decision to remove him from the crew. Instead of disappearing, Nick chose to confront his struggles publicly. He began treatment and committed himself to recovery. In a deeply personal essay titled The Deadliest Disease, he described how addiction had stripped away the passion he once had for fishing and for life itself. For a time, it seemed his life was finally moving in the right direction. He returned to work, looked healthier, and dedicated himself to staying sober. After everything he had survived, many hoped the worst was finally behind him. Tragically, it was not. On December 27, 2020, Nick McGlashan was found dead in a hotel room in Nashville, Tennessee. He was only 33 years old. Authorities later confirmed that he died from an overdose involving a toxic combination of drugs. The news stunned both the Deadliest Catch community and longtime viewers who had watched his fight for recovery unfold over the years.
Unbelievable. Oh. We lost Nick. Nick's dead.
Nick's death was especially heartbreaking because it came after so many genuine efforts to rebuild his life. For those who followed Deadliest Catch, the death of some of the deckhands was too hard to bear. However, the next came the sudden loss of Mahlon Reyes. Mahlon Reyes. When news broke that Mahlon Reyes had died at the age of 38, many believed he had suffered a fatal heart attack. But as investigators uncovered what had really happened, the story became far more complicated. From the beginning, fishing was more than a career for Mahlon. It was the life he knew. The long hours, freezing temperatures, and relentless pace of the Bering Sea were simply part of the job, and he rarely complained about them. However, away from the boats, Mahlon lived a very different life. Friends and family described him as easygoing, kind, and deeply devoted to the people he loved. He looked forward to returning home after every fishing season, where his focus shifted from crab pots to spending time with his fiancée, Heather Sullivan, and their children. Those closest to him often spoke about how much he valued his family and how determined he was to build a better future for them through commercial fishing. That is why the news of his death came as such a shock. On July 26, 2020, Mahlon suffered a medical emergency at his home in Whitefish, Montana, and was rushed to the hospital after going into cardiac arrest. Early reports described the incident as a heart attack, and many fans believed that was the cause of his death. Despite doctors' efforts, he never regained consciousness. After several days on life support, his family made the heartbreaking decision to let him go. However, as more information became available, the official findings told a different story. The coroner later ruled that Mahlon Reyes had died from acute cocaine intoxication, with heart disease listed as a contributing factor. The updated report surprised many people because it differed from the early accounts that had circulated following his death. For those who knew him personally, the news made an already painful loss even harder to process. Mahlon's ashes were eventually scattered in the Bering Sea, the waters where he had spent so much of his working life. While Mahlon's life ended far too soon, the next story centers on a captain who helped carry Cornelia Marie through one of its darkest chapters until his death. Tony Lara. After the death of Captain Phil Harris, the future of the F5 Cornelia Marie was uncertain. Phil had become the face of the vessel, and replacing him was never going to be easy. The job required someone who understood both the demands of the Bering Sea and the emotional weight the crew was carrying. Tony was one of the few people who fit that description. Tony had spent years working in Alaska's commercial fisheries and had developed a close friendship with Phil Harris. Their relationship went beyond the water. They trusted each other as fishermen, business partners, and friends. That history made Tony the natural choice to take command of the Cornelia Marie after Phil's passing, even though everyone knew no one could truly replace him.
Replacing Jake on the rail is the captain himself.
He was the first guy to hire me on the Cornelia Marie when I was 15. So it's kind of a crazy deal.
When Tony appeared on the show during Season 7, he helped guide the crew through one of the most emotional periods in the show's history. Although his television run lasted only a single season, many fans remember him as the steady hand that kept the Cornelia Marie moving when it could easily have fallen apart. After leaving the series, Tony returned to working away from the cameras. He remained active in the fishing industry and continued focusing on the business he had spent most of his life building. Then, in August 2015, tragedy struck without warning. While attending the annual motorcycle rally in Sturgis, South Dakota, Tony died in his sleep. He was just 50 years old. An autopsy later determined that the cause of death was a heart attack caused by severe coronary artery disease. The sudden loss stunned friends, former crewmates, and fans who remembered the calm captain who had helped carry Cornelia Marie through one of its darkest chapters. Tony Lara's time on Deadliest Catch was brief, but his impact reached far beyond the number of episodes he appeared in. A few years later, another former Deadliest Catch captain also died unexpectedly, but this time after a long struggle away from the spotlight. Blake Painter. For several days, no one had heard from former Deadliest Catch captain Blake Painter. As concern grew, friends asked police to check on him. What officers found inside his home marked a tragic end to the life of one of the fleet's youngest captains. Blake Painter represented a new generation of captains when he joined Deadliest Catch during its early years. As captain of the FV Maverick, he stood out because he was one of its youngest. Before becoming captain, Blake had spent years working his way up as a deckhand aboard the Maverick. He understood the job from the ground up and had already earned the respect of the people around him. Blake appeared during the series' early seasons when the show was introducing audiences to the harsh realities of crab fishing. Although his time on Deadliest Catch was relatively short, Blake left an impression. After leaving the series, Blake largely stepped away from the spotlight. While fans occasionally wondered why he disappeared from the show, Blake chose to keep a much lower public profile, allowing the next generation of captains to take center stage. Behind the scenes, however, his life became increasingly difficult. Over time, Blake struggled with substance abuse, a battle that gradually overshadowed the promising career he had built on the water. In early 2018, those struggles became public when he was arrested in Oregon on charges that included driving under the influence and drug possession. For many longtime viewers, it was the first clear sign that the former captain was facing serious personal challenges. Just a few months later, tragedy struck. On May 25, 2018, police found him dead inside his home in Astoria, Oregon. Investigators found no evidence of foul play, but the circumstances surrounding his death raised immediate questions. A toxicology report later confirmed that Blake had died from an overdose involving fentanyl, cocaine, methamphetamine, and tramadol. His death also reflected a painful pattern that had affected several people connected to Deadliest Catch, where struggles away from the sea sometimes proved even more dangerous than the storms they faced on it. The next name on this list is another reminder that some of the deepest scars aren't always physical. For Jake Harris, losing his father changed the course of his life in ways few could have imagined. Jake Harris. When Captain Phil Harris died in 2010, millions of Deadliest Catch viewers mourned the loss of one of the show's biggest stars. But for Jake Harris, it wasn't just the loss of a captain. It was the loss of his father, and it marked the beginning of a struggle that would eventually lead him far from the Bering Sea. Jake Harris grew up around commercial fishing, but most people first met him as the younger son of Captain Phil Harris on Deadliest Catch. Life aboard the Cornelia Marie was never easy. Phil expected a lot from both of his sons, and Jake often found himself working under the pressure of living up to his father's standards. Their relationship had its share of disagreements, but there was never any doubt that Jake admired him. As the seasons went on, viewers watched him grow into a more capable fisherman, gaining confidence with each trip and showing flashes of the captain he might one day become. Over the following years, Jake's life became increasingly troubled. He developed a serious addiction that gradually took control of his personal and professional life. Instead of making headlines for his work on the Bering Sea, he became known for repeated encounters with law enforcement.
One of the stars of the show, Deadliest Catch, was arrested early Saturday morning right here in the Valley. According to Phoenix police, a woman was traveling here in Arizona with Jacob Harris.
Arrests involving driving under the influence, drug possession, and other offenses began replacing the hopeful story fans had watched unfold during the show's early seasons. His legal problems reached a new level in 2019. Authorities in Washington state arrested Jake after he allegedly led deputies on a high-speed chase before crashing his recreational vehicle. Investigators reported finding heroin, drug paraphernalia, and a stolen firearm inside the vehicle. He later pleaded guilty to several felony charges and was sentenced to 18 months in prison. The case marked the lowest point in a downward spiral that had been building for years. Unfortunately, the prison sentence did not bring an immediate turnaround. After his release, Jake continued facing legal trouble, including another arrest tied to drug-related offenses. Each new report was difficult for longtime viewers to read because they remembered the young deckhand who had once shown so much potential. What could have been the story of a fisherman carrying on his father's legacy instead became a painful example of how grief and addiction can reshape a person's life. Jake's struggles played out in the public eye because millions had watched him grow up on the Cornelia Marie. The next deckhand never had that level of fame, but his life after Deadliest Catch was defined by an equally troubling cycle of addiction and arrests. Jared Secrest. Jared Secrest spent only a short time on Deadliest Catch, but the years that followed brought far more attention than his television appearance ever did. A series of arrests and criminal charges eventually overshadowed his brief career on the Bering Sea. Jared joined the crew of the FV Northwestern during Season 10, stepping into one of the most demanding jobs in commercial fishing. Working aboard the Northwestern meant meeting the high standards of Captain Sig Hansen and a crew known for speed and experience. For someone new to that environment, there was little room for mistakes. From the beginning, Jared struggled to keep pace. Crab fishing on the Bering Sea demands constant focus, physical endurance, and the ability to react instantly in dangerous conditions. Even a brief lapse in concentration can put an entire crew at risk. Viewers noticed that Jared often seemed overwhelmed by the workload, falling behind as the rest of the deck crew moved at full speed. Before long, it became clear that life aboard the Northwestern was not working out, and his time on the boat came to an early end. The years that followed took his story in a far darker direction. After leaving Deadliest Catch, Jared became involved in a series of legal troubles that steadily grew more serious. Among the most widely reported cases were allegations of organized retail theft in Florida. Investigators accused Jared of repeatedly stealing merchandise from Home Depot stores and attempting to resell the items for profit. He was also arrested on multiple occasions for drug possession, grand theft, and violating the conditions of his probation. Each new arrest suggested that addiction had become a driving force behind the choices that were pulling his life further off course. For the next person, addiction and legal trouble also overshadowed the career that once seemed destined for greatness. Elliot Neese. When Elliot Neese took command of the FV saga, many believed he represented the next generation of Deadliest Catch captains. He was young, ambitious, confident, and seemed to have a long future ahead of him on the Bering Sea. Instead, his story became one of the show's most dramatic downfalls. Away from the cameras, Elliot was dealing with problems that were becoming impossible to hide. He admitted that he had developed a serious addiction to drugs. This battle had not started after he became captain. Elliot revealed that he had been introduced to Schedule I drugs when he was just 16 years old. What began as teenage experimentation eventually developed into a serious addiction that followed him into adulthood. By the time viewers watched him command the saga, he was already fighting a battle that had been building for years. As his substance abuse worsened, it began affecting both his personal life and his performance as captain. The pressure of running a fishing operation, combined with his addiction, created a downward spiral that became increasingly visible during later seasons. Eventually, Elliot made the decision to leave Deadliest Catch and seek treatment. At the time, he later confirmed that he had entered rehabilitation and publicly discussed his efforts to get sober. For a while, it appeared he was making meaningful progress, and many longtime viewers hoped he would eventually return to the wheelhouse. Those hopes faded as new legal troubles emerged. In 2022, federal authorities arrested Elliot following an investigation into drug trafficking. Prosecutors alleged that he had been involved in distributing large quantities of heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl. Investigators also recovered firearms during the case, leading to additional weapons-related charges. A money-counting machine and more than $80,000 cash were also found. Elliot later pleaded guilty in federal court to drug trafficking charges and received a lengthy prison sentence. The outcome effectively ended any realistic possibility of returning to Deadliest Catch or rebuilding the career he had worked so hard to establish. Instead of being remembered for his skills on the Bering Sea, his name became closely associated with addiction and serious criminal convictions. For many fans, Elliot Neese's story remains one of the biggest missed opportunities in the series. Why do you think so many former Deadliest Catch cast members ended up battling addiction or losing their lives to it? And do you think their lives would have turned out differently if they had never appeared on Deadliest Catch? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.